Today I want to look at one of my favourite features from Act 1, Chapter 1 of Historia. Something you may or may not have noticed, but this is the music in what we call Doug Act 1 Scene 2. So let me just unmute the sound effects. In fact, I'm going to turn the sound down because that's not really important. And we're going to return. So this is the second scene that you see. You've just forgotten your phone. You think you're going to go back to Max's house and get your phone back and life will be good. And you're sneaking into the house. And you can hear right now, we already hear that low, I think it was a cello is what we start on. And then as we progress through, we hear more and more instruments coming in. So you can just hear that there's a viola or a violin coming in there. And then as we go through a couple more scenes, we have more instruments coming in. So we've got that violin 2 coming in on the left. I think the Glock comes in on the next line. Or maybe it's the next line. Oh, no. More and more strings. So we're building with the strings. So every line that we go through, we're building more strings, building more tension. There's that Glock coming in. Everything goes through. We start to feel like we're going up the steps. And then after a couple of things, there would normally be the sound effects of the serpent and the ward going through here, but I've turned those down because what I wanted to focus on was the music. And then there's this bit. Everything goes black. Doesn't matter how many times I hit space. Doesn't matter. And then all of a sudden halfway through there it jumps into that transition and we see the serpent for the first time. So let me just mute the audio there. This isn't my idea, this is actually Beck's idea, and it just took a long time to make it work. So we wanted to have that sound, the music, be one of those cues that would build, and you wouldn't maybe notice it. And one thing that I do actually like, if I turn the music back on, is if we roll back, you'll find that as you roll back, those instruments actually drop out as well. So if I roll back a few, you would have heard them drop out there, and now we're just back down to a couple of strings. You can't hear the Glock, you can't hear the high-pitched violin. I think that's super cool. So, how on earth do we make something like that happen? So let's have a look at what we've got here in the game script. So the first thing you have to notice is that we have a lot of additional tracks for sound going into Historia. If you start with your basic defaults, you're going to have one music track, you're going to have one voice track, and you're going to have one sound track. And unless you register additional tracks, you can't use them, you can't manipulate them, you can't do anything with them. So what we're wanting to do here is add in an additional, I think we added an additional 20 or something tracks. And you'll see here that we've got what we call BG, and then we have a whole bunch of FG. Now, originally the BG was going to be the music and the FG was going to be the sound effects, but due to me not understanding what was going on and not communicating well with everyone else, we ended up having the foreground as the background and the background as the foreground. One thing that you can do when you register a new channel in Ren'py is, or Ren'py, whichever one you want to say, you can decide which mixer it's going to go to, and that mixer is which one of those faders you have here on your option screen. So we have music, sound, and voice. You could, if you really wanted to, add in a few more of those, or you could have a mixer that was not displayed on the menu screen. So if you really needed to, you could have an audio track that people couldn't affect. So they'd turn down the volume or the sound effects and expect to have a quiet game, and then bang, you hit it with a jump scare. I think it's a dick move, but you can do that. So that's the mixer. So after we have the mixer, we have the loop. So the loop basically says defaults to looping or default to playing once and stopping. We set all of those to none because a lot of our looping is handled within the game itself. Stopping on mute equals true will mean that the file actually kind of stops buffering whilst it's being muted. Now we just leave that as true because it saves a bit of memory, and you can imagine that, as you can probably see by this stream being pretty crap, we don't have much, we've got a lot of memory issues. File suffix and file prefix is if you're using audio sprites or something. To be honest, I don't really use those, but they're in there, we're defining them anyway. But we have two properties here that are quite useful. The first one is tight, and the other one is buffer Q. Now, tight is useful because even as you're fading in and out, if you've got a loop, it will continue to loop whilst you're fading in and out, rather than getting to the end of file and stopping before your loops or before your fade is finished. That's really important to me because a lot of our sound effects are repeating, there's a lot of gurgling, there's a lot of water bubbling, and if it stopped halfway through a fade, you'd really hear that kick out. The other one is buffer Q. This is true for basically all audio files, and you keep it false for video. Putting something into the buffer queue means that when it's available in a scene, it will actually pre-buffer and preload it, and that becomes really important for this next part. So now let's jump into scene 2 and let's find where we start all these bits of audio, and then how we make sure that those transitions between each line happen when we want to, and that they also happen in time. So we actually start off all of the individual parts and a master. This master is actually all of the mix. It's a full mix of all the above tracks. We start them at the same time. And there's a couple of key things to note here. One is that each is on a different channel of that music mixer. So they're all using those FG channels that we found before. We've set them all to loop here. As I mentioned before, we try and do that in the game here. And then we have fade out none, because when we want it to stop, we want it to stop on that point. But we do fade all of them in over 0.5 of a second. That's something I do for pretty much all music files. I don't want it to start immediately. I need it to bring it a little bit, because if you bring it in immediately, especially if it's like a BGM track that's got a loop point in it, if it's built to loop, it means it will start usually very hard. So you want to have a bit of a fade to move it in. The other ones here are quite important here. So we have synchro start here setting to true. And what synchro start does, and you can see it's here available on all of those tracks, synchro start will make sure that they all start at exactly the same millisecond, basically. If you don't have that, you can have a little bit of latency, which doesn't normally show up, but when we were beta testing, we found that there was actually a couple of times where one of the two tracks would drift if you didn't have that synchro start set up. The other thing here we've done is we've actually turned off that tight looping, again, because of the way we want to trigger this. We wanted it to happen when we said do it, and if we wanted to stop it, we wanted to stop it straight away. The next thing we do in the same command, so the way Ren'py works is after you finish this line, it'll run everything before it actually starts the next line here. And we've actually put in a transition here as well. We put in all of our channels, we start them all, and then we actually mute pretty much all of them. That's what we're doing here. So with the set volume command with musical sound, the first one is which volume we want it to go to, and the second parameter here is how long it's going to take. So we want all of that to happen at that instant, so we shut everything down. What this means is in the background, all of these tracks are playing, but at the moment the only thing we're hearing is the bass. So you can see here that's at 75, and it starts straight away because the fade is handled up here in the 0.5. So we go through a couple of scenes. You know, he approaches Max's house, he tries the door, and what we actually do is, with a lot of my sounds, just as a side note, I actually use extend quite a lot. So halfway through the line, I'll actually break the line, play the sound, and then it will go off. Okay, Serpent Movie BG. So now we're inside here, and you can see that we are also adding in on the sound effects side, and we can see we're using the sound mixer here, Ren'py sound, rather than Ren'py.music, and we're actually doing the same thing with 3 distorted waters. So similar kind of thing, but with that water is also building at the same time. But even though it's an ambient background, it actually had a bit of loopiness to it, so we wanted to make sure they were synchronized, and we pushed those through. But because it was sound and it wasn't musically critical to get them on time, we didn't have to worry with the synchro start. So again, we put one channel up, and it's only at 20% now, and we have the other channels down. A cool thing here is because we can do 3 seconds, it'll actually fade that in over 3 seconds. Okay, next we have the cue. We say we're going to fade in the cello. So over 1 second, we fade in the cello to 75%. So we move down a bit here, and you can see we do this a few more times. We set the volume down here. We go to 75% on the viola, and then we start mucking around. I start mucking around with heartbeats and water. So we're just going to skip those for now. Maybe we'll come back and do a sound tutorial later. Next one, we bring in the violin. You can see the same thing, but now because we wanted the violin, it was a bit higher pitched, I wanted to actually sort of bring that really into your face. We've gone for 100% volume there, but it takes a bit longer to come in. So it musically starts at the same time. As soon as you hit that line, the violin will just start building up into your ears there. And I believe that violin's panned out to the left as well, so you really feel it coming in over to the left hand of you, over your left shoulder, basically. We've got some zaps in there. Then we bring the glockenspiel. Again, you can see I'm doing a bit of mixing here. The glockenspiel was a bit too loud in the initial recording. So in the master as well, you'll feel that the glock actually comes up pretty high. I didn't like that so much, so I knocked it down to 60%. We basically build in all of those, and then comes the hard bit. This is, as you can see here, this is where he creeps up the stairs. And we have that point where he comes up the stairs, doesn't know what's happening, and you start clicking, you don't know what's going on, and then all of a sudden the music changes and you see the serpent. There's a lot going on here, as you can see, between this line here and the next line down here. We have all of this happening in the middle. So what are we doing here? The music is set up so that there's, at the end of every measure, you could change from track 1 to track 2 quite easily, and then back again. And you'll notice that if you play through the scene more, you'll actually see that we do that towards the end. We go back towards this more subdued version of the track. So what we're going to do, the first thing we're going to do is we actually need to find out where we are in the track. So we need to find that. So let's go and have a look at our functions here. So this is one of our function areas here, and I'll try and not show you any of the other functions that are going on because I'll explain those later. So the first thing we can do is we can use the get pos to find out the position in a track of any of the music channels. So we can go down there and actually, if you look at the scene, we pass it foreground 1. You know, all of those tracks are playing at the same time, and they're all exactly the same length. So as long as we get it from one, we can get it from any. The next thing we do is we find the signatures. So these are the time signatures in seconds. Thankfully, it was, I think, I can't remember if it was 120 or 180, whatever the BPM was. It actually parsed straight to a full second, which made things nice. And then these here are the signatures of when we can change from one track to the other and back again without hurting anyone musically. So we go down, if we say, if nothing's playing, we say 0 because nothing's actually playing. If the signature isn't actually in any of those signatures, we just return 0 again as well. Otherwise, we basically come back and say, what's the difference between our time now and the time in one of these signatures? And then what we do is we actually return that time signature there. So what these exceptions are doing here, which I probably should have used a switch case or something, we're basically saying that if the things don't line up, or if it just happens to be exactly on one of those signatures, change it straight away, because we're right on the beat. So let's change that track over. If not, then let's make a float that is between those two there, because and why a float? We have to use a float because the is playing and get pos is going to return us a float. So we're taking a float from an integer. We have to have a float with its million decimal points. So that's the first thing we do. We find out where we are. We then hide the window, which is the text bar underneath. We then go to black. So everything goes to black. And we actually dissolve that over the same time as the float, as the music has to change. And that's why it kind of disappears and you don't really know what's going on, and it will always change no matter how many times you play it. Then we also, after it's completely gone to black, we actually then hide the video and start getting those resources back. Next, what we do is we actually play the audio of the serpent in the background, and you can see I've got low left and low right. These are two serpent rules that I use. One goes to each ear, so it feels like it's really wide and you don't know where it's coming from. Then we pause for the duration of that float delay. So that will wait until the next part starts. And then what we do is we actually stop a lot of those individual parts because we're not going to use them anymore. And by stopping them, we free up resources. Then what we do is, you can see here, we actually keep one Glock going because I wanted to have one glockenspiel playing later on in the track, and we bring up the foreground 7, which was the part 2. So if I go back up to the top here, you'll see foreground 7 is Serpent part 2 master, not part 1. Okay, then after that we go through a few more things. You're allowed to move back through the game again, and then we go through and do a few more things. So you can see we have more roars, we have more of these set volumes coming through at different times. I think this is where we have the one Glock playing by itself, so I have volumes going up and down, but playing in the background so that we can bring them back up whenever the reader gets to that point, and basically continue them in time with all those different parts going. So there you have it. That's the way that we got those audio to build up over those first couple of scenes. That's how we paused the game to make sure that it was paused long enough for you to say, what am I going on, but then also what's going on, and then also at the same time having it so that transition happened there. So let's go back and have a quick listen to that. If we go back to our game, and we can hear that in action. So we go, as we go through each individual, we can now hear a couple of extra strings coming in. There's the Glock. And I think the glockenspiel really kind of pulls this whole scene together, and that's why I kept it low here, but then brought it back in by itself individually later. Let's see if it still works. There you have it. Okay, so that was our first tutorial on what we've done in Historia and some of the technology there. I hope you liked it. I did originally have a bit set up where I was going to use the Scrivener make name function to make up a whole bunch of Patreons, but it turns out we actually have one, so thank you to No Heal for you. Next time I'll come back and tell you how to use functions to give people names. Bye!